Hi there. You're listening to the Council of Canadians podcast. This is Getting into Fights with Data Centers, a conversation with Anne Pasek recorded on April 2nd, 2026.
So, welcome everyone. My name is Drew. Drew Oyajay. I'm the executive director of Council of Canadians. Really happy to be here today and happy to see you all here. Great turnout. I'm joining you from Val-David, Quebec, which is on unceded Algonquin territory, north of Montreal, otherwise known as Tiohtià:ke. So just a few words of introduction, just to frame why the sort of council is interested and concerned about this issue. So Canada's in the middle of a massive push to create hundreds of new data centers. Alberta alone is basically advertising that they want $100 billion in investment in data centers. And this is part of a kind of a global multi-trillion-dollar push to create basically as many data centers as possible. So McKinsey, this sort of consulting corporate research group, estimates that investment in data centers will reach just under $7 trillion globally by 2030. So there's a massive build out happening, and Canada is very much part of that. So the scale of some of the projects proposed in Canada is also staggering. One proposed data center in Alberta, the one championed by Kevin O'Leary, who it's a name some of you might be familiar with from Shark Tank, among other things, Lang and O'Leary Exchange, would be powered almost entirely by fracked gas and would have a climate impact similar to putting 6 million new fossil-fueled cars on the road year-round. And so that's one of the most dramatic examples. But just a few weeks ago, Saskatchewan approved a new AI data center owned by Bell specifically for AI, which is also mainly powered by fracking, although it's not advertised as such. And it'll have about the same climate impact as 200 to 300,000 automobiles on the road. So that's just one data center that's currently being built. So needless to say, these projects are a massive threat to our water, our land, and our atmosphere. And that's for that and other reasons, we're very happy to have with us here today Dr. Anne Pasek. She's a professor at Trent University. Dr. Pasek holds the Canada Research Chair in Media Culture and the Environment, and is also the author of the zine titled Getting into Fights with Data Centers, where this session gets its title from as well. So a warm welcome to Anne.
Thank you, Drew. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. And I guess you can't hear the applause, but I know it's there. So you wrote about getting into fights with data centers 3 years ago. And a lot of people have indeed gotten into fights with data centers. So I'm just wondering, what has the last 3 years been like? What do you feel like you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, when we see what the sector's been up to, and how civil society has really tried to engage the sector, I'd say there's been a lot of mistakes, but also a lot of lessons learned from those mistakes over the years. There are definitely better or worse ways to try to claim that your project runs on green energy. There are better and worse ways to work with local governments on a project. And there are better and worse ways to talk about and build environmental politics around these systems, to debate who is, responsible for the impacts that come from a query from ChatGPT, for example. But I really worry that in our contemporary moment right now, because there are so many AI companies that are prioritizing speed over best practices, we're making a lot of the same mistakes over again, and to maybe even a greater order of magnitude than when I sat down and first started writing on this topic. So to give just one example, there are many tech companies that have spent years deepening relationships, developing partnerships with wind and solar companies. They've got really deep pockets. They are perfectly willing to finance the creation of clean energy generation to sit on the same grid where their data center will be. But when this AI data center boom kicked off, which was maybe 23, 24, it meant that pretty much all AI development has been just too impatient to wait for the permitting and construction times that would come with bringing those new sources of clean power online. Instead, as you mentioned, they're like really just increasingly turning to methane gas to get the job done. It's a worrying trend. You mentioned Wonder Valley. That's going to be, when it's fully complete, 7.5 gigawatts of new gas generation. And to give a sense of scale, like 1 gigawatt of power is about the size of a large city. So we're talking 7.5 new cities of energy being thrown at these things. And that's a serious climate and air pollution problem. There's promises that they will, like maybe eventually put carbon capture and storage on these things. But they are not promising that they will do that by any particular dates. And we know from so many past projects with CCS that that stuff is almost always over budget and underperforming. So when we say yes to projects like Wonder Valley, we're saying yes, essentially, to huge pollution problems. It did not have to be that way, but I guess Kevin O'Leary is, just too impatient to build things in a slower and more deliberate way. At this point, we do kind of know what a bad project looks like when we see it, and we are seeing more and more bad projects. And I think that we've got to get our brains together and think about how to, make that curve bend in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean the theme of speed really seems to be kind of crucial here. I just saw a news item a few weeks ago where it's like they're repurposing jet engines from decommissioned military planes to
Yep.
become turbines to like power data centers. Like that's how fast things are moving in terms of like, okay, we'll just literally pick up anything around that resembles a turbine and repurpose that. So yeah, so this, just to that point, this the speed and the scale of data center build out is so massive, that's like almost, yeah, it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around. I guess one part of the question would be, do you have a way of like understanding the scale that we're sort of talking about, or that the sort of people building the data centers are talking about?
Yeah.
And I guess also just like, how would you describe this build out, and what do you see as the sort of main implications of that speed and scale?
Yeah. I mean, we are kind of in a new era when it comes to hyperscale. Increasingly, the sector's smaller players are getting priced out. And it really is only large conglomerates that are kind of striking out as power supply is more and more constrained. Only really folks who were able to sort of bring like cities worth of data center online and through all these unconventional means. So like just following the energy, following the water usage of these things can be one way to kind of wrap our heads around what we're looking at. Another way would be to think about capital expenditures. And here too, like these are increasingly unprecedented. So the amount of money that the American tech sector is spending on data centers in America last year is higher than the amount of money that all Americans spent as consumers in the economy. And it's gotten so large that it's probably like disguising signs of a recession in their economy. You don't see a sector just kind of throw cash at a problem so desperately as we are in this rush to build bigger and better, presumably better AI models. Lately I've been thinking about this in part because it's not clear that there really is going to be a return on that money. No one is making a profit on this stuff yet. These companies are kind of just bleeding cash because they believe that they need to build like a bigger and better product to win a kind of monopoly position in the AI market, to outrun their competitors. We've seen that again with the smaller players, but increasingly they're kind of biting at each other. And one implication of that is that we are almost certainly in an economic bubble right now. And when it pops, I do think we're going to likely see some significant bankruptcies. I think this matters a lot to communities that are debating whether or not they want to invite a hyperscale data center into their community. Because there is a non-zero chance those data centers might end up abandoned. And tax revenues promised might not actually check out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I guess to sort of add on to that, I mean, you're talking about the sort of, yeah, massive amount of investment, and the uncertainty of that investment. But I guess in the context of that, like throwing everything at the problem, how do we imagine a sustainable version of data centers? Like, is that even possible? What does it look like? Yeah, curious to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a good question. I often answer it by saying that, this is probably going to be a question of harm reduction rather than being green or being sustainable. There is no way for these structures not to have an impact. The question really just is what we can do to limit that impact. And are we doing so in a way where there's enough benefits for the community that hosts this infrastructure to think that they have a fair exchange at hand? So there's maybe two sides to that. Like on the incentive side, we should ask, are these companies going to pay their taxes or are they hunting for tax breaks? We should ask, are they going to do much to invest back into their community? And that could be sort of like helping pick up some lagging digital infrastructure there. That could mean contributing to local colleges and universities. It tends not to be on the order of jobs. These spaces are per square foot like some of the lowest performing industrial sectors for job growth. So you got to get a benefit out to the community through other means. The other side of it would be harm reduction, right? So we should be asking when we're looking at these proposed projects, are these projects going to be responsible for the cost of upgrading all of the energy infrastructure they're going to need to power that site? Or is that something that everyone who has a power bill in that grid going to end up paying for, which is the default right now? We should ask, like, are these people going to partner with clean energy and storage companies, bring in batteries in to sort of stabilize out the swings we get from renewables? Or are they just, again, going to build more gas turbines? Are they going to do closed loop water cooling? Are they going to overdraw water resources to the extent that they impact the aquifer, like underground, which is a non-renewable resource in many places? Are they going to be responsible treating the water that exits from their facility? Or are they going to release water with like hyper elevated like agricultural chemicals in it, which is happening in many jurisdictions in America? Have there been studies done to address potential noise pollution issues? It really is a question of being thoughtful about the development process, about listening to local concerns and sincerely trying to mitigate them. It's about driving towards a more acceptable bargain where and when people do want to have these infrastructures as neighbors. But that all takes time and trust, which are two commodities these tech companies are just really quite short on these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I guess just to get into, I guess that specifically, what do you see as the sort of motivations? Like, why is there so much money going into AI and data centers specifically? And what's the drive there? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting puzzle, isn't it? Right. We're definitely in a moment of irrational exuberance, which is a fancy way of just saying, again, like an economic bubble. And we got there through a few different factors. One is that there are some tech CEOs who sincerely believe that they're inventing like a new general purpose technology, that AI will be as important and as ubiquitous as energy is in today's economy to the one right around the corner. But another way to look at it is that they want to sort of race to build something that will be a monopoly product that will lock everyone into their platform, that they can then raise the prices on, as Cory Doctorow has laid out as a pattern of behavior in the tech sector. So, if you bleed money today, maybe there's, a large share of the pie to win down the road. But another answer, and one that sort of keeps me up at night, is that if this stuff ever does become profitable, it will get there largely by automating people out of their jobs, or at least de-skilling and speeding up a lot of jobs so that bosses, have more control over workers. They feel emboldened to pay people less money to do worse forms of work. Like the economic gains promised by AI largely are just gains to management. There probably is no free lunch here where everyone becomes just like so wonderfully more productive that we decide somehow to pay the same number of people to work like a 4 or 3 day work week for the same amount of money, unfortunately. So that's worrying.
Fair enough. And I'm curious, just sort of sociologically, you know, I'm sure you've been keeping track of a lot of different sort of fights with data centers around the world, or around the continent at the very least. I'm curious how like what kinds of trends do you see emerging? How are people developing their tactics, their strategies? And I'm also curious if there are links being created between the sort of what we could call the upstream fight, which is the at the source of the data center, and the impacts, the climate impacts, the noise impacts, the water impacts, and so on, and the sort of downstream effects, which are like somebody was mentioning Palantir, which is obviously on our and AI military targeting systems, you know um, um, algorithmically enabled like sexual assault, or
Mm.
mental health issues, like all these different things that surveillance in the workplace, all these different things that are sort of happening that people are fighting, I think, on the downstream end. Do you see links being created between those two?
Not enough, not yet, I would say. Uh, which is interesting, right? Where we see people really dig in their heels and throw their shoulder against the wheel, trying to slow down or prevent data centers from being built. It usually is because they have direct skin in the game, and that their energy bills are going up, or their aquifer is getting overdrawn, or they have to live with the noise pollution of this thing in their backyard. And it has made a kind of groundswell of opposition to these things, particularly in the States. Like we saw in the last off-season elections, that if there was a candidate who was against data centers, they won their election. So we know that this is sort of a popular and important issue to more and more people. But it's largely remained a local issue. And I think that that's a kind of strategic oversight. You know, I think absolutely grassroots support that is located in the areas where these things are being built will be extremely essential to standing up effective opposition. You want to be able to go before a very local, like, water use permit hearing and make the case that this isn't in the interest of your community. And you just can't do that as effectively if you are a lawyer who works for an NGO in another city, or an anti-war activist, right, on the other end of the country. But building coalitions, like making friends, is really substantively important to kind of making an effective and enduring campaign. And then like being able to share knowledge across different territories. That work is only just now starting to happen. Like if there are folks out there who think they have a data center fight on their hands, or want to join in one, there's a really great resource that's been published recently by an NGO based out of Europe called Algorithm Watch. They have a guide to data center resistance that I recommend. And you'll see that it's really about like knowing what meeting you have to show up to for what permit, in order to kind of magnify the scrutiny on the environmental claims that the data center companies are going to make. And building expertise to parse those claims is important, but like you do need to physically be in a room at a time and a place to make that happen. So if we can get all the nerds and all of the people in rooms in conversation, if we can get data center protest movements around the world talking to each other, that will all be for the good. And as more and more of these things are getting built, I mean, more and more of us are kind of on the front lines of them. So what we start now, we may pick up directly ourselves later.
Excellent. I, I mean, my sense is that in the US, like things are things have gotten to a pretty much a boiling point in certain places. Not both literally, I guess, in the terms of the heat islands that get created by these data centers, but also just in terms of the emotional reaction I think that people have um to having these things in their backyard and having it affect their like local living conditions. Um, but we haven't, it feels like we haven't quite seen like so in the US, like elections are being won and lost on support for data centers, like um you know like broad spectrum protest movements are happening in like towns where these things are planned. I don't think we've certainly seen some rumblings in Canada, but we haven't seen anything like that. I was just wondering, I guess both on the sort of, is there a regulatory reason for that, or are there different reasons for that that you would sort of point to? And I guess broadly, I'd just love to hear your reflections on the difference between Canada and the US in terms of the data center sort of emerging fights.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a question of scale. Canada has not yet been host to as many data centers as the States has, particularly like in regionally concentrated spaces. Like Virginia's data center alley has just been a bit of a ticking time bomb for this issue. And we don't have corridors that are quite as jam-packed with these things as they do. But also, I think it's just a kind of, politics is so often a question of opportunity and chance, and like the winds of fate are on the backs of data center activists in this particular moment. As you know, again, people are sort of thinking like, actually, like I hate this AI stuff, and why should it be here? But I do think that conditions on the ground in Canada could change pretty dramatically in the coming few years. There's maybe like three different reasons for that. One is that in the States, like local governments are beginning to regulate some of these companies, and doing so out of fear for their own political fortunes. So we've seen an increased amount of like energy tariffs get stood up to sort of even out, ideally, some of that unequal energy tax load. There's been what's called the ratepayer protection pledge that a lot of tech companies have taken on voluntarily. Just I think again, like out of self-awareness that they are not winning popularity contests right now, and they want to turn that around. So their work in the States will get a little bit harder, but it's really not clear that any of those promises are going to extend into other countries. So as things heat up in the States, we could see companies just trying to bring their business to Canada, assuming that, like it won't be quite as hot here. Secondly, on the other hand, if Canada goes all in on data sovereignty, we're looking to build a lot more data centers on Canadian soil. And in some instances like that, that's important work. Like, I don't think you or I want our emails or files to be routed through American jurisdictions. That means our data can be intercepted by ICE or the NSA, a whole host of other security organizations that are not particularly well known for their love of the rule of law. But it's also simultaneously the case that like a made in Canada approach to just simply duplicating all that infrastructure, that calls for a lot of careful thought about what gets built where and on whose dime. Like I don't think a kind of massive wealth transfer to Bell or Telus is gonna do us favors in the long run. And again, like I don't want to see these things get built through a fleet of gas turbines that are going to stick around for decades, even if these things do fall into decline. And then the third reason, and to a far greater extent than is true in the States, one distinction that Canada has is its like relationships with First Nations and Indigenous and treaty communities. So if we build more data centers in Canada, inevitably that's going to intersect with a lot of land right disputes and governance claims. And it's certainly the case that like First Nations communities in Canada do not speak with one voice. So there may be, one community that does want to have a partnership with one data center company, another one that doesn't, or even within a community, folks can be split for and against impacts on water rights, most likely, if I were a betting person. And that really is a set of decisions for these communities to deliberate on. And it is up to the developers to put together compelling economic benefits packages. But I do think that if we do see a rush to build data centers in Canada, that rush will probably find some headwinds, right, on these lines. We've already seen that with Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, who issued Wonder Valley a cease and desist because they were not consulted at all before the project went public. And so, like, from that example, I think we could see a repetition of some of the coalitional politics that characterized how environmental groups engaged with anti-pipeline activism, for example. So again, If you want to get into a fight with data centers, you should probably be in the business of making friends. And there's some important friendships to sort of strike for or deepen there. So I do think that Canadian data center politics might look quite different from the States for that reason.
And other than making or beyond making friends and some of the other things you mentioned, would you have any advice for people who want to get into fights with data centers in Canada?
Yeah. Um, uh, Definitely don't do it alone, right? Sometimes I get people who email me who want to who feel compelled, right? There's a project in their backyard or in their watershed. They're worried. Uh, and the first piece of advice I give them is that you need to find a buddy. It needs to be at least one person who is going to be your ride or die, because this is a kind of long-term struggle, and you're going to need their support. And you're going to need to articulate your identity as a group rather than you as a kind of sole truth teller to the data center. So find a buddy. Second, think about your advocacy efforts in the shape of a campaign. So this means that there needs to be a key decision that you want to influence. And again, Algorithm Watch's guide will help you identify some plausible ones around land permits or elections, right? There's got to be a date in the calendar where you succeed or you fail, which is scary, right? But that adds urgency to how you're going to think about organizing, where you know that you need to put your foot on the figurative gas, and where you're looking at a bit more slack in your schedule. But you do need that focus, because you do need to, again, identify these key decision points where things are going to change, and then you want to change them. And success here could look like getting a project canceled. It could look like delaying one long enough or adding enough reputational concerns that the developer just decides to go elsewhere. Or maybe, the bubble pops and it turns out that the thing doesn't need to get built after all. Success might look like getting a big project scaled down, or with enough credible mitigation measures added that that you're not going to be stuck with a really terrible neighbor. Or success might look like trying really hard, losing at that key decision point, but knowing that you're making things tougher for the next data center that comes through, and sort of helping, get lessons that you can share back with people who are organizing in other communities, and just broadly encouraging the public and key decision makers to bring a little more scrutiny to this set of choices. So even if we don't win every fight, you want to set things up in a good way for the people who come after you. And I fear that there'll be another one and another one and another one as time goes on. So yeah.
Amazing. Well, that concludes the sort of questions that I had in the intro here. We were making great time. So we definitely have some time for people's questions. So I think Eagle is going to open up the chat, and I'll sort of read. I'll select some as they come in, depending on how fast they come in. But yeah, maybe one that I wanted to ask as we wait for people to get their questions in the chat is, you have one sort of tactic that we're sort of considering using is just demanding transparency and demanding sort of regulations around transparency in terms of how much water is used. What you see, I mean, I guess just to preface it by saying, what you see at a lot of these data centers is that they'll say things that just aren't true. Like they'll say things to journalists and they'll be like, "Oh no, we've totally already dealt with the water issue. It's a non-issue." But then you read the details and you're like, "No, it actually is a significant issue." So I'm just curious about your thoughts on demanding transparency as opposed to demanding a moratorium or demanding a shutdown of sort of new data centers. All of which are sort of things that have been advanced. I think even Bernie Sanders right now is calling for a moratorium, which I haven't seen floated at all in Canada. But I'm curious just to hear your reflections on that.
Well, I think Abby Lewis's campaign was talking about a moratorium. So there are Canadians thinking that thought. In terms of what is the prize to win there? I'm not sure that there's like political momentum to win that moratorium yet. Like we'll see what the next election campaign brings our way. But in terms of like immediate concerns, I do think it is going to be like winning those transparency standards that will help set things up for better and more developed oppositional politics in the future. And you're right that like facts can be pretty hard to find, especially in the early days of these projects. Part of that is because these large hyperscale companies, Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, they tend to work under LLCs. So like a different company's name will be on the product at the beginning. And quite often there will be non-disclosure agreements that get signed with contractors and sometimes also with city council. And like this is something they will say they have to do for like competitive reasons, like that there are trade secrets in how much water these sites are going to use. That's increasingly hard to buy as these details come out more and more. And it's just really essential information that communities need to evaluate things, both experts in that community who can say this will or this won't, like drain our aquifer or salinate our drinking water, and just everyday people who have a right to know. So um, again, that's where being in a room and asking really inconvenient questions, or continuing to write letters to the editor, or do public information requests, that kind of information activism can really have a substantial weight over the longer course of a campaign. So I think it's really important.
Amazing. So there's a whole bunch of different questions here, and sorry, folks, I didn't see the Q&A before. It's in a separate section. I hadn't opened it, but thank you for all your questions. I guess I'll start with there's one about closed loop cooling, which I feel like is a very sort of pertinent topic, and then maybe I'll just tack on a few other questions. Somebody else is asking, can industrial water rates apply because the AI has to use potable water? And then the other one that's maybe related is there's a Chinese open source AI company that was supposed to be free or open source and put the US version to shame and nullify any profit that can be made from monopolies, and just kind of curious about that.
Yeah.
Hopefully
So
those are related enough that you can sort of bundle them, but go ahead. Yeah.
I'll take those as two questions. One about water, how it works. One about open source products and what's going on in the kind of like economic ecosystem. So the water cooling part is not intuitive. Like it doesn't make immediate sense to a lot of folks on the ground because we cool our houses and apartments without evaporating tons of water. What's up with that? These data centers are basically an extremely temperature controlled environment. They need to be, because if they don't, the chips that are in the servers doing all the calculations will heat up so much that they will melt. So number one priority is to keep them happy, and keeping them happy means keeping them cold. Quite often, traditionally, this means that you just have massive air conditioning systems that use water to hold heat that gets evaporated. And that can be bad news if you set up a data center in the middle of a desert and you draw water out of a straw, you run it through the data center, you steam it off. That water will float away somewhere else, potentially beyond your watershed. It won't like rain down, and you'll have a net loss of water. So if you're drought constrained, if you're part of one of the many parts of Canada that, because of climate change, is experiencing more droughts, like that is a problem. You do not want that. A mitigation measure, again, like harm reduction, but not harm elimination, is to do a closed loop system. So that's where the water stays in the pipe. It gets precipitated out and reused. There is going to be some kind of cleaning system built into that engineering complex, because when you draw in water, even clean water, it's still got some microbes in it. And microbes love being warm. So if you just have a tube that's circulating the same water, you're going to end up with a tube of thick slime, which will stop cooling your data center. So you have to scrub the water clean in a cold loop system in order to keep it looping, which means that you're going to be having some effluent, right? Like you're going to have some goo that you got to get rid of. And it also means that that closed loop doesn't stay closed forever. You do need to drain it and refill it periodically. So there's still water being consumed. It's not an innocent, guilt-free, get out of jail card kind of thing. And it does, in some cases, sort of raise the ante of the water pollution part of it. Because if you're drawing water from a source that, is downstream of a bunch of farms, and those farms are spreading phosphates, or I don't know, nastier pollutants, those that are harmful for human health, into that water supply, and you are discharging a hyper-concentrated version of that water at the end of your cooling system, you're kind of worsening the pollution problem, actually. So Amazon, I think in Oregon, has been tangling with that problem. And it's something we should really keep our eyes on, something that we should be building into our environmental assessments. So water will always be something we want to look into, regardless of the system. That's maybe the water part, partially settled. The open source part. So yeah, in 2024, the company DeepSeek, or the model DeepSeek, was released. It was produced by China, and it was released open source, which is not uncommon in the AI space, but less common than you'd like. What made it distinctive was that it was quite small, so that you could indeed like download a local version. You could have a little like desktop computer in your house that is running all of the inference for this model, instead of having that in a data center, because it's so large and so energy intensive. And the performance was pretty comparable, not as good, but still pretty impressive compared to the Americans. And so there was a week where AI stock prices crashed, and everyone was like, "Oh no! Like we've thrown all this money at data centers for naught." But after just a few short weeks, those stock prices went back up, and people kept building data centers because the presumption was sort of twofold. One is that by continuing just to throw compute at these American models, eventually there'll be some kind of breakthrough that makes them super good. That's a hypothesis that we do not have a ton of evidence to support, but it is a business strategy and like a talking point that is common in the Valley, that's common with a lot of governments, so people are still trying. The other business reason, and maybe this is the one that I think is more sincerely held, is that these companies just assume that making things efficient is going to drive more demand. So even if all models go the way of DeepSeek and become like smaller and more energy efficient, that will still build a world where AI use is so ubiquitous that we need tons of data centers anyways. This gets called Jevons paradox. It was true of coal and the steam engine, right? Like those things got more efficient, but coal expenditures kept going up. That might be true of what AI looks like in a version of the society where all the CEOs get their way and all of our jobs get massively enshittified by these models. So efficiency won't save us, I'm afraid. And this means also the Chinese are, a competitor in this AI race. They offer a different trajectory, but they aren't like an unambiguous environmental ally in the fight either.
I mean, we do see a sort of a similar paradox with like fossil fuels. Like the more you create renewable energy, the cheaper fossil fuels become, because demand over time decreases, but then because the price is lower, people use it more, and so you end up with this sort of a loop unless you step in and regulate. I did want to follow up on a few pieces of the water part. One person was asking, I guess specifically what rate system do AI data centers in Canada have to use? And I wanted to tack on to that. I mean, it seems to me that like cooling the chips is one part of why you need water for data centers, but in Canada specifically, a lot of the water use ends up being cooling, as I understand it, the sort of turbines as well, because you need to cool the natural gas burning, generators that fuel these places. But then you also have the sort of water impacts of the fracking that you're doing, where you're in some cases poisoning the groundwater and also using quite a bit of water there. So if you could comment on those two things.
Yeah, it's not great. So the exact rates that these companies are going to pay are going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And many municipalities and like regional economic development corporations will try and negotiate to get them the cheapest rate possible. Because that is sort of seen to be a major draw. Because these like hyperscale data centers we're talking like 5 million gallons of water a day. So they want that to be fractions of pennies. Otherwise, that's going to be quite a big bill. So they're not paying what you and I are paying for our drinking water, even if they are using our drinking water. And then the other question was about, like the kind of like larger impacts. If we look up the whole supply chain of AI, and absolutely you're right. You might have all heard the like data point that like a conversation with ChatGPT equals like a 500 milliliter bottle of water sort of poured out on the ground. That stat has some controversy around it because it includes all of the water that goes into producing the electricity that flows into the data center. Electricity, if you have a thermal plant, regardless of whether it's a gas turbine or a conventional asset, that uses a lot of water too. Because, if we are doing steam to power a turbine, that steam is going to evaporate off and again, maybe move to a different watershed. So how we calculate this can be a kind of endlessly receding horizon, right? Of different things to worry about. It can make a person feel pretty overwhelmed, or it can make like an AI booster kind of like nitpicky about what we count and like, oh, we should only care about this one tiny part of the system. My advice is to think about the part of the world that you have responsibilities to, the part of the world that you have some political power over. So, that's probably going to be your local political council. That might be your watershed, your aquifer, that might be your electrical grid. Those are all things that, you have responsibilities towards. Those are all things that you are going to need services back from in order to live the life you want to live. So dig into that part because that's where you're going to have power.
Thank you. I also saw a few questions about, I think people are really curious to sort of understand the gradations of like, what's a good data center or what's a better data center, what's a worse data center, like how impactful is it to use, Zoom versus ChatGPT versus something else. And there's also sort of a suggestion of using like Ecosia, like a, more environmentally friendly search engine. And I know your zine really gets into the topic of sort of personal choice versus sort of collective action. I'd love to sort of hear you sort of reflected a little bit on that point as well in this context.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Like I will say that I myself do not use generative AI. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's helpful for me personally. And also I do sort of sit with discomfort with the knowledge that it is this kind of order of magnitude more resource expenditure than like a traditional search or, hanging out in Photoshop and drawing that picture in the first place. But I really don't want to endorse a version of environmentalism where we like hang out and scold other people for like doing the wrong thing. Like I do think these kind of like well-intentioned efforts at like raising awareness can really backfire and can prevent us from doing what we really need to do, which is make friends. So, we don't want people to sort of relate to this movement as like judgy. Even though like everybody makes judgments all the time about what's a good fit for them and what they think might be a good fit ideally in most cases for most people. But if someone falls outside of your best fit, they could still be a really important ally for you because, they might share a grid. They might share a watershed. They might be willing to give up a Thursday afternoon to come with you to a public hearing because they're concerned about this stuff. even if they are a ChatGPT user. So I just think that like quite a lot of our like good intentions can get stuck in these places where we're spending so much energy like trying to be a good ethical consumer and just kind of giving up on that as the beginning and end of our politics, and having that be more something that we're doing on the side. I think that that actually like lets us exhale, lets us like recenter ourselves and again like think about like what do we need to do to build the power we need to take down the larger system rather than just like feel a little bit better about the part that we individually occupy within it. Oh, I fear you're muted.
I share your fear. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I just want to follow up a little bit on the first part of that. I guess like, can you think of a good example of a data center that's properly being done? Um, and I guess yeah, like if what would be your sort of thumbnail sketch of a data sovereignty plan that actually holistically makes sense? Maybe that's a $64,000 question that would take another hour to explain, but curious to hear your answer nonetheless.
Yeah, I've got a colleague here in Sweden where I'm living for the week who has tried to answer this question, tried to find the best, greenest, most ethical data center that she could find here in Sweden, and sure enough, there were problems. If you really look, it turns out it was a Google data center that was looking quite environmentally immaculate, had even contracted with some wind power suppliers to get green electricity brought into their data center. But that wind was being built in an industrial park that was displacing indigenous people in the north of Sweden. So the point of her argument was that even the good data centers, you're still going to find conflict. And I think that that's kind of a lesson that we should learn and hold well. That conflict is going to apply wherever we do see industrial development, because there's always going to be some kind of harm. And the question is just not how do we, wash our hands and get to be like innocent, but how do we ensure that we're being really serious and knowledgeable of where the harm might be? And how are we ensuring that we're reducing that harm to the best extent that we can? And how are we making sure that people who are shouldering the brunt of that development getting fairly compensated, which was not the case with the Sami in this wind park. So when I think about what that might look like, I have only like general terms to share because I think it will be a really localized story of how that those benefit agreements might get worked out in practice. But I do imagine that it would be helpful to have like data center energies get pushed into some sort of larger project at decarbonizing our grid, building more wind and solar in places where people are okay with that wind and solar sitting, pairing it with batteries, pairing it with a high transmission corridor to move that energy around different parts of our very long country. So that when it's like sunny in Regina, Vancouver can benefit. Um, I think that means that we have to sort of think about like federal leadership in building public infrastructures that are going to have legitimate public benefit, and then using these private companies to sort of push money in that direction, so that even if they leave town, even if they go belly up in a few years, they've still left something behind that's a legacy we want to have around. So that might mean, like data center parks where there can be like permitting and consultation that's done at the scale that's appropriate for these kinds of hyperscale infrastructures. And I think it means being a little more serious about, as you were pointing out, not just adding green energy here and there on the grid, but really thinking about how we turn the ship around. Because yeah, climate change is real, and this is all not helping.
Um, there's a maybe we just have a few more minutes, but there are some really interesting questions. I've been trying to sort of pick the ones that are representative of the overall themes. But maybe you could comment briefly on, I guess, the overall like Canadian government's sort of stance toward data centers, and sort of how you see that and what sort of opportunities or threats there are there. And then there's also a question about the crypto industry, specifically sort of Bitcoin mining and other kinds of crypto mining, that obviously have a lot of crossover in interrelation with AI, and in some cases have been banned, but AI hasn't been banned. Anyway, so I'm curious to hear your sort of reflections on those connections as well.
Yeah, so Canada, as always, is a land of contrasts, and my home province of Alberta is part of that story. You mentioned up front about Danielle Smith making it a kind of a development priority for Alberta to attract as many data centers as they can, it seems. I really do think we need to interpret that move as part of that government's longstanding alliance with large oil and gas producers. Because again, like a new data center today tends to mean a new gas generator plant. So I think that it's an obvious kind of alignment of interest for that government, but I don't think that's an obvious alignment of interest for the Canadian people at large, as an Albertan. It's also the case that federally, we do have a lot of discussion about what leadership might look like, but not a lot of concrete steps. The federal budget, even as it cuts many important and essential services, did have many millions of dollars to throw at vague AI development projects. It's not clear that those are going to be projects that are doing that kind of important infrastructural work to ensure that we are getting a handle on this industry regulatively. Instead, it just seems to be to invite it in, and not always on our terms, right? Like there are lots of unanswered questions about how to negotiate American ownership of a lot of these companies, even if they sit new facilities down on Canadian soil. So where I would like to see the conversation go is to be really quite vocal that there are going to be winners and losers in how this question gets settled. And we don't want the winners to be tech billionaires and oil companies, right? And ensuring that happens means that we do need more politicians to show real leadership, to provide real strategies, and their like electoral success, and like the reach of that ambition is going to be accelerated the more and more everyday people step up and sort of dig into these fights in their local communities.
Amazing. Well, I think we'll wrap it there. I did want to say real quick that the Council of Canadians is organizing a civil society summit on AI in just a little under 2 months in Montreal. And Anne will be there, I believe, and along with many others. We've got 9 panels, so there's going to be a lot of different perspectives about AI. And shout out to Yana, who's in the chat there, who's been working really hard on this as well. And so I'll put the link in the chat if folks want to take a look. It's aicivilsociety.ca. And I guess to somebody else's point, the recording will indeed be available on Canadians.org. You will be able to find it there. So keep an eye out in the coming, let's say, week. So, a big round of applause, a big round of silent applause distributed across the country, maybe around the world, for Anne Pasek. Thanks again, Anne. Invaluable insights, and really appreciate your taking the time to chat with us.
Well, always a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to bend your ear collectively.